so it's a good day to just remember that nurturing and what we always think of as mothering doesn't know any particular gender. It happens when we care for those who are entrusted to us for whatever period of time that might be. It might be a week, it might be a lifetime. And those of you that have a lifetime probably say, oh, gee, a week, you're kidding. But happy Mother's Day to everybody. Just before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered this morning is the traditional territory of the Munsee Delaware Nation, the Chippewas of the Thames Nation. Many mothers have given birth on this very piece of land on which we now give birth to new ideas and to God's new creation. So we give thanks for the stewardship that's gone on, and we pledge to continue to be good stewards with our Indigenous brothers and sisters of this land and all the land that we are so blessed with in Canada. And I think of all the things we have in this country. It's mind-blowing at times, isn't it? Just resources, the people, the landscape. It gives me cause every day to give thanks, and I'm sure it does for you too. In terms of announcements, I don't have very many. Just one announcement that I'd like to make. I am going to be away for the next 2 weeks on vacation. This was some vacation I didn't take last summer. So the session has looked after the services, and Pastor Mary Dillon will be looking after any emergency pastoral care that might come up in my absence, and I will be leaving her telephone number with the session, the clerks of session, and also with Wayne, chair of M&P. So if you have a pastoral emergency, give Mary a call. You can get her phone number from Josh or Jan or Wayne, and it's very personable. I think that you'll. So just so that you know, sort of when minister's away, you always leave somebody to cover any pastoral emergency. So if somebody's very ill and needs a visit, or if somebody's, heaven forbid, dies, this kind of thing, please give Mary a call, and she'll be more than happy to help you out. Is there anything from the congregation this morning that we need to be aware of? Okay. I know we don't have any children here this morning, but since we are all children of God, does anybody want to light the Christ candle? No takers. Okay. It's like the puppet store. Oh, here comes Dave. There you go, Dave. I don't know, those kids that we have, they set a pretty high standard for us. So. You got this set up? Oh yes, it's all set to go. Turn it on? No, it just yep, there you go. Thanks, Dave. Each new day reminds us of the light that dwells within us, the light God has placed deep within our hearts. And so as we light this Christ candle, remembering that we are made of light and love, remembering that we are called to bring light and love to others in the world. Let us pray. Loving God, creator and keeper of all life, we praise you this day. In each opening bud, in each blossoming tree, you invite us to experience your presence and to find ourselves as part of all life. You nourish us with beauty and bring alive ancient words of wisdom. We are born from you, and in you we live and move and grow as your community of faith. Deepen our appreciation for your wonder and mystery. Just as a child is formed in their mother's womb, we are formed in you and made into your body, your church, and your blessing for the world. For this we give you thanks today and every day. Rather than having a reading, I thought it might be nice for a couple of minutes to engage in a little bit of storytelling, because today is a day that we set aside to remember mothers and families. And all families are different, and we find mothers in our biological mothers, but also many, many others. And so I thought we could take a few moments, if you so wish, to share a little story, anecdote, memory that you have of a mother, grandmother, or Sunday school teacher, or school teacher, somebody that was a special person in your life for whatever reason. And because I think that, as Frederick Buechner says, look to your own life, and there you will find the ongoing theology, the ongoing work of God. So if anybody feels so inclined, take time to share. Yeah, Pat.
I grew up in Cornwall, Ontario, and went to a church called St. Paul's United. Mother's Day was a big thing, as it is in most churches, and the local YMYWCA had a fundraising event, and they sold carnations, and everyone who came to church wore a carnation. If your mother was alive, you wore a carnation of color, and if your mother was deceased, you wore a white carnation. And everyone wore flowers, and it was a wonderful fundraiser for the community as well. That's a memory I had this morning.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Anybody else have something they'd like to share? Yeah, Jack.
Now that I've got the microphone. My mom lived till 98, and which was a record for all her siblings, and I don't know if she was that proud of it, but she talked about it a few times. But she loved and adopted Jan from the very beginning. I was the first. I'm from a family of 4 boys, and I'm the second oldest, but I was the first one married, so my mother and father Jan was the daughter they never had. But Jan found something just the other day, cleaning out some stuff, and she said, "We can't throw this out." It was a little thank you card that my mother had written probably only 2 years before she died, thanking Jan mostly for going to see her so much at the nursing home, and having her down to our cottage a few times, where on a summer day, she would go out and listen to the birds sing and look at the lake and fall asleep in a chair. And she was just so grateful for all those times. But at the very bottom, she had some other stuff written, and she was squeezing it all into the page, and I do not know how anybody can write that small. It's cursive writing, but like you'd get on a pill bottle that you need 4x readers to see. But that's just a funny little memory of my mother.
Jack. Oh,
you got your own mic.
I guess I do, yeah.
I have a funny memory too.
Go ahead.
My mother was a clean freak, and I had an uncle who used to say, "Edith, if you had a coat of arms, there'd be a mop and a broom on it."
The memory that I was just going to share was actually of a grandmother that I had, my dad's mom. And she was a remarkable woman. And she had been widowed very young, raised my father on her own in the dirty 30s, and which was unheard of. She didn't want my dad to have a stepdad because she was afraid he would be mean to this boy that wasn't, quote, his. And so she raised my dad on her own. He went off to war, and she was by herself. Fortunately, came back from war as well. But she was, as I remember her, she lived in poverty. She had many strokes, and by 55, she could no longer work. And this was a time when there was no old age security, no unemployment insurance, none of those social programs would take for granted. To this day, I don't know how she managed. She had good friends. My dad, of course, helped her, and she lived in Curtin Lake, and we would go to see her, and she would always say, if I was still working, I could do this for you, I could do that for you. But I just loved her because she told great stories, and because, she was my Nana, and she really had a strong influence on my life, even though she didn't live very long in my life either. I was about 10 when she died. But she was just, when I look back on her, she was one of those people that society probably saw as somebody that didn't have any worth because she wasn't able to work, she didn't have a husband, she lived by herself, and she couldn't contribute. She had several strokes, she had cataracts in the days when you wore those big, thick glasses. But to me, she was the epitome of what a grandmother was. So just the way that we see people, and so differently than how others might see them. The idea of a comfortable place is something that I think we all long for, give thanks when we have it, and work towards building it when we don't have it. Psalm 23 is probably the most well-known psalm, and the one that people often turn to in times for comfort, for a sense of being connected to the scriptures. In all of the years that I have been in the ministry, I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I have not used the 23rd Psalm at funerals, when people are really at their rawest and at their most vulnerable. And it surprises me that so often people will say to me, Kathy, I'm not a religious person. I don't really want a lot of stuff. And I ask them about readings, whatever. And I just mentioned, I want the 23rd Psalm. And everybody seems to gravitate to that psalm at a time when they're looking for comfort, looking for a sense of meaning, looking for connection beyond themselves. It seems to be, I don't know if it's because of the familiarity of the piece or what it is, but it seems to be that psalm, more than any others, is one that people will really take to themselves of all of the psalms. And it talks really, when I think of the 23rd Psalm, I think really about this sense of comfort, this sense, not comfort because everything is easy or the way we want it, but comfort knowing that we are held by a God who does not let us go, even in times when we feel very disconnected from God. And so I think that when we think about mothering and about that sense of nurturing, that sense of caring for those who are vulnerable, if you think of, my gosh, a little baby, and all of their needs are dependent upon you. Any small little creature, whether it's a human creature or a baby in another domain, they're all vulnerable. They all need to be cared for. And then I think of people that have grown up and maybe have been through incredible trauma, or they're very wounded, and so that sense of care, that sense of providing a safe and place for them. And I know that any of you who have worked in places where Jan, you would have had this at CPRI, I certainly deal with it, and lots of other people are dealing with it. Edith, your daughter, is a social worker, is dealing with this all the time. That one of the things when we're dealing with people who are hurting, who are wounded, who are searching, who are struggling, that one of the first and most important things is that we provide a place where people feel safe and not threatened, where they feel that they can be who they are. And as a church, I know this church and the United Church in general, we strive to do that all the time, to provide places where people can simply come to worship and not worry about who they are, what they've done, who's going to accept them, who's not going to accept them, but to come and realize that we are all accepted with God, that all of us matter and all of us belong. And so I think on this particular Sunday, we think of many of the women in our lives, or many of the people who provide that kind of nurturing. Because in some families, it's the men who provide more of the nurturing, and the women provide other things. So this, when I say mothering, it doesn't know any particular gender or expression, but that sense of caring, of nurturing, of birthing, whether that's a child, a dream, a social cause, whatever it is, but that sense of bringing to birth, that sense of launching out into the world something new. And I think today on this Sunday, I don't know if probably many of you are aware of this, but this is the 60th anniversary of the United Church Women this year. They were formed in 1962 when the WA, the Women's, was it Women's Auxiliary? No, the Women's Association. The Women's Association and the WMS, the Women's Missionary Society, came together as one. Before that, there were women's groups in the church. There was the WMS that sent missionaries, we did that in those days, to lots of places in Canada, to overseas, various places, and the Women's Auxiliary, or the Women's Aid, which was more sort of the fundraising arm or the service arm of the women's work. And if you read any historical accounts, you will read that one of the things at the time of church union was that all of the uniting churches that came together had these women's groups that had a lot of clout because they had a lot of money. And these were women that, had bake sales and raffles, and not raffles, but rummage sales and all kinds of things. And it's kind of fun to read the accounts sometimes of these young ministers that would go to these churches. They were all men, of course, at that point, pretty much all men. And they would say, well, they would get to this new church, and the first thing they wanted to do was meet the woman who was head of the Women's Missionary Society, because that was the person that you really had to watch out for. And so these were very strong women, and they set up things like CGIT to train young women to take leadership roles. And explorers, I know some of you were involved as explorers, and CGIT girls, Canadian Girls in Training, as members, as leaders, and that was the work of some of these early women's groups that wanted to train girls at a time when girls stayed home and, were homemakers and mothers, but we certainly wouldn't be looking to girls to take leadership positions. So it was these forward-thinking women that started so much of all of that. They would be aghast, I guess, if we called them feminists, but really they were. They were those women who were advancing and saying, hey, look, there's another way that we can strengthen our leadership pool. Look at all these potential leaders that aren't being tapped. And so I chose this piece of music that we just sang, particularly for this day, because I think, and you can Google this and find it online, but if you look at the verses of this, come celebrate the women who brought the church to birth. Well, we know that if we go right back to the very beginning, that Jesus was born of the woman Mary, a young peasant girl. And the gentle revolution, that sense of, and it's, I guess, coming into modern times, it's not always gentle, but the sense of shaping young lives, shaping the way things happen, whose minds and hearts were free, and their direction was peace and harmony. And when we think of all, I love the second verse, the teachers, saints, and mothers who lived and died unsung. And isn't that the truth? The things that we've learned from people. When I think of people like my grandmother, the woman I just told you about, her name was Frances, but they called her Frankie Tavel. And, you know, when I think of her, she didn't make any history books. She didn't make, you know, probably the only people that would remember her are my brother and sister and I. And yet, and I've talked to my sister about this, she probably had more influence on our lives than anybody else. Just by the way she handled all the adversity in her life, the way she was able to, no matter, I mean, like I said, she lived in absolute poverty. And yet every Easter, you know those Laura Secord Easter eggs, the cream Easter eggs? Every Easter, there were 3 of those on our table. Every birthday, there was a card with something in it, and to this day, I don't know how she did this, but she never ever missed anything with us. And I remember playing cards with her out at the lake, and I was just a little kid, and so I'd play cards, and I'd say, "Oh, Nanny, you don't." She didn't see very well, you know, so I'd say, "Oh, well, you don't really want those cards." I always won the card games, you know, no kidding, and but she didn't care. It wasn't about that for her. She was playing cards with me, and that's all that mattered to her. And I look at people like that, and, you know, lived and died unsung. Nothing she did would make headlines or get trophies, and yet her example and the way she touched people's lives, that never dies. And that's how it is with all of us, our own mothers, fathers, anybody that we've lost, when they've left a legacy of a life well lived, regardless of what age they pass away, that never ever leaves us. And so this final verse, daughters of the disciples, you weave the story still with fabric of the future. And so that call to discipleship, and I think I talk about that a lot, I know, but our call to discipleship in this time, because, you know, it's easy for us to say, well, you know, we've just come through a pandemic, this is really hard, you know, oh, it was so much easier when everybody went to church, and, you know, it's easy to get into that, isn't it? And yet, when we look at the record of history, we realize that each group, each generation, each person has had the challenges that were in their life, that weren't before or after, but somehow they faced them head on. And it was often these women that would just keep going. And often I've met many of these women in my life, and I say to them, you know, how do you keep going in all of this? And they say to me, Kathy, you put one foot in front of the other, and then you do that the next day and the next day. It's not a choice, you just do it. And how would life be different if we all just did it? We're coming up to a provincial election, and we're already seeing the signs, and I've had people phone and, you know, drop cards off at the door and stuff. And I think to myself, you know, I'm so glad that we have the right, the freedom to elect the people that we want. But gosh, I wish they would just state the point and forget all the, you know, the stuff that you ask a question and it takes about 5 minutes to answer. And yeah, I was looking actually for a yes or a no on this. So just do it. Just do it. You know, daughters and sons of the disciples, just do what needs to happen. It doesn't matter if there's fanfare. It doesn't matter if the media is there. It doesn't matter who sees it. Just do what we're called to do. Just do what Christ asks us to do, to love those who no one else loves. I was walking the dog this week, and I bumped into a woman that I'd talked to before, lives in the Indwell building on Dundas Street, has some fairly serious issues. And I bumped into her a couple of times, very chatty, very chatty. Well, this time I bumped into her I was walking Rufus. She had a little dog, so walking towards me. The encounter was very different. Her dog started barking. She's back. Well, he's picked him up. He's aggressive. Well, then the next thing, She tells me, well, I need to get my dog under control. Oh, my dog's just walking along and then starts yelling all these expletives at me. And I thought, I understand this because I've worked enough with it, but so easily it can flip. The one time I meet her and she's chatting up a storm, taking me on as her best friend. The next time she's yelling expletives at me on Queens Avenue. And I just kind of smiled and I thought, these are the very people that God's calling us to love, to accept, to reach out to, because there's things beyond. It's not about me, it's not about it. It's just, that's where she's at because of the trauma. And it's easy not to love the kind of people that shout expletives at us. And yet, those are the very people that that we're called to love. It's a big task. And so, sometimes, who becomes our role model? I would suspect every family has people that are just gems and other people that are not gems. They're difficult, they're crabby, they're mean, or all of the above. And yet when we sit down to dinners and family dinners, everybody's there sometimes, if they can be. And as little children, and I suspect this happened in your home too, why do we have to invite so-and-so? Because they're family. Well, I don't like them. Well, you know what? We learn from everybody, and you sort of have that sense that not everybody that sits at the table is somebody you're going to chum up with, whether they're part of your biological family or part of your created family, because we have families that we choose. But we're all there. Because, why? Because Christ calls us to. And so often it was our mothers or grandmothers or aunts or whoever that said, listen, just accept them. They need to be here. And so that constant example, and I think that's what we all are called to do, especially at this time when there's a lot of challenge in our world right now. A lot of people are struggling. A lot of people are looking for something other than what the media, the politicians, social media, all of those things are dishing up to just say, you know what, it's okay and I care about you. And that sometimes blows people's minds, as well it should. And the more minds that we can blow open with that, the more room the Spirit has to come in and create new lives. So let's go from today being the daughters, all of us, the daughters of the disciples who weave the story still. And let's weave a story of love and compassion and, and acceptance so that all people can feel worthwhile. All people can feel that they truly are the children of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Kathleen's story. Camp is more than a holiday. It gives young people skills that last a lifetime. Kathleen is a special education teacher, a busy mom with 3 children under the age of 5, and a youth and young adults coordinator at her church. She says her early summer church camp experience continues to impact her approach to each of these important roles. Camp taught me that children are precious and we're there to help and guide them. Vespers taught me to take a deep breath in times of stress. Chaplain showed me how to bring out the best in children and draw out their talents. All those things I learned from camp, I now apply to my everyday world, including motherhood, says Kathleen. Kathleen grew up in very formal churches where she felt she had to be perfect all the time. Outdoors and in an informal setting, her faith blossomed. I never really felt connected to God before going to camp. It opened up my experience to what church is. My relationship with God expanded. I learned to pray, to reflect, and to experience God in nature. Those early lessons continue to ground Kathleen in trying moments. Today, because I learned to connect with God in nature, I can take time to reflect and I can show God's love. When I'm too stressed, I can take a quick look at a bird or tree and remember that God is with me when a student is expressing their frustration. Staying calm and showing God's love is huge. It goes a long way. I remind my own children that God is with them, even in the hardest times too, she says. Before COVID, approximately 200,000 children attended a United Church camp every year. During the pandemic, many camps provided virtual support to young people during lockdown. I just want to say a huge thank you to mission and service donors for their support of camps, says Kathleen. I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for their support. Thank you. And on a personal note, in 1959, I attended the United Church camp at Sparrow Lake, north of Rilliet, and it was great.
For your minute and for your personal testimony. Camp changed my life too. I wouldn't be here without that experience. So I really support camps. We have a connection with Camp Kimoki just down the road. It's a wonderful place for kids to get started with learning how to be away from mom and dad or those kinds of things. So hope we can really continue to support our camps. All right. Well, as we think about Kathleen and our children and our camps, let's gather for prayer. Gracious God, we are so thankful. We're thankful for our young people, for the Kathleens of this world, for Chip, for all of those who have been able to see differently and find their faith because they have gone to camp or been outside in a forest and had a sense that you were there with them because you were. We're thankful for this country, this place where we can on a regular basis be out in nature and be surprised and cajoled and comforted by the creatures who pass by. As our native brothers and sisters would say, when things get difficult, the Creator sends a message in an animal. And so we see a deer or an eagle or a turkey vulture or whatever right on this property. And it reminds us that we are connected to you and to things that are far beyond our immediate knowledge or understanding. So we give you thanks. We give you thanks for the mothers in our lives, those who nurtured and cared for us, those who held us when we cried and put Band-Aids on our knees, those who continue all through our lives to accept us and cherish us for who we are, because in those people we see a reflection of you. We thank you for the vision and foresight of many women who went before us in this church and in many others in this church that we now call our own United Church, women that saw a need and responded, with their prayers, with their work, with their money, and with their dreams. Many at a time when it was not fashionable or accepted, or even in many cases allowed. And yet, they challenged that status quo because it was the right thing to do. And so, God, we pray that we, men and women, might continue always with those lessons that we learned from those who went before us. That when we do the right thing, it is never wrong. And when we do the wrong thing, it will never be right. And so we ask that we too might have the courage and the heart and the motivation to speak up, to be that person who calls out the bully, who speaks truth to power, who doesn't let something go when someone is being hurt. God, we ask that as we think of those who are being hurt, we remember especially the women and girls in so many countries, including our own Indigenous women and girls in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and many, many other places known to you, where they are not allowed to go to school, where they are under persecution, where they must provide for large families because men are off making a living or fighting for that which is important, or unavailable for whatever reason. And we especially hold up before you women who are raising children by themselves for whatever reason, and those who need support, and those who are feeling trauma. We ask, God, that you, particularly today, be with those mothers who have lost children, children who have lost mothers, women who long to cradle their own child, but that was never possible. Mothers who have done the best they can and look now and wonder if they could have done better. Mothers who rejoice at their children's happiness or success or love. Those who long to be around children but are unable to do so. For there are so many expressions, God, so many expressions of ways that you come to us and ways that we respond to your love. And so on this day, which can be a celebration for some and can also be a time of deep pain and hurt for others, we ask you to gather us all up as your children, for you are both mother and father to all of us. And so in the name of your own child, we offer our prayers together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.